You've shared a really interesting book with us, Elaine Gavrilyuk's Social Cognition, specifically the construction of the self in social contexts. It's pretty dense stuff.
It's packed with insights.
And we're going to take a deep dive today into Chapter 10, which that's the one that tackles all this stuff about cognition and group processes, group decisions, group thinking, heuristics, those mental shortcuts we take, and that thing called the introspection illusion.
Right, right.
You seem really curious about how our thinking changes, especially when we're with other people. And, well, this chapter really gets into the nitty-gritty of why we make the decisions we do, which, sometimes we don't even understand ourselves. It's kind of crazy when you think about it.
It is, yeah.
So today we're going to try to unpack some of these key ideas, illustrate them with real-world examples. Some might be funny. Some might be a little bit unsettling, I guess. But hopefully, by the end of this, you'll have a much clearer picture of all the different forces that are shaping our thoughts, whether we're alone or in a group.
It's like there's this whole hidden world of influences we're not even aware of.
Exactly. So let's jump right in. One of the first things that really stood out in this chapter was Kurt Lewin's field theory, which basically says that our behavior isn't just determined by our personality, but also by the situation we're in. He even came up with this formula, B, F, P, S, meaning behavior is a function of both personality and situation.
It's a simple formula, but it has huge implications.
I know, right? It's like we always talk about someone's personality like, oh, they're always so shy or so outgoing. But Lewin is saying, hold on a second. The situation itself can have a massive impact on how we act.
Yeah, like sometimes the situation can be so powerful that it almost overrides our personality completely.
Yeah, exactly. And he talks about this idea of our living space, which is basically how we each individually interpret and experience a situation. It's not just the physical environment, but also all the people involved, any past events that are relevant, even our own memories. And all these things carry a certain valence, which is basically like a motivational charge.
Right. So some things have a positive valence, like something we're attracted to, and some have a negative valence, like something we want to avoid.
Yeah, it's like we're in this field of invisible forces pulling us in different directions. And all these forces are competing for our attention and our energy.
It's a constant internal balancing act.
Totally. The book gives the example of someone who's trying to write an essay and keeps getting interrupted.
Oh, yeah. I hate when that happens.
Me too.
Yeah.
And suddenly they're all irritable and snappy. And it's because their entire living space, their mental focus, is on finishing that essay. So any interruption feels like a huge disruption.
It throws off their whole equilibrium.
Totally. And this is where the idea of being cognitive misers comes in.
Yeah.
We're always trying to conserve our mental energy, right?
Absolutely. Our brains are like, let's find the easiest way to do this.
Exactly. And when we're interrupted, especially when we're close to finishing something, it creates this kind of mental tension. And that's where the Zeigarnik effect comes in. Have you ever heard of that?
The Zeigarnik effect. Yeah, it's the idea that we tend to remember unfinished tasks better than completed ones.
Isn't that weird? It's like those unfinished things just keep nagging at us.
It's like our brains are trying to remind us to go back and finish them.
Makes sense. But what happens when those valences we were talking about, those motivational forces, are in conflict with each other? The book talks about this idea of cognitive reorganization.
Yeah, when we're pulled in opposite directions, our minds try to find a way to resolve that tension, to reach a new balance.
Right. Like imagine someone at a party who's really attracted to someone else, but also super scared of rejection.
Oh, I've been there.
Who hasn't, right? So their behavior, whether they approach that person or not, depends on the interplay of those positive and negative valences.
Plus other things in their field, like how confident they're feeling that night or how many other people are around.
Yeah, it's like this complex equation in their head. And then there's this idea of barriers in our living space, both physical and psychological. And these barriers, well, they can really mess with our motivation.
Oh, tell me about it.
Like, you're on a diet and you're doing great, but then you have one little treat. And suddenly it's like a dam breaks.
And you're like, well, I already messed up, so might as well go all out.
Right. It's like that one slip up makes you feel like you've totally violated a boundary, and then it's a free-for-all.
It's like the floodgates open.
Exactly. So there's all this really interesting stuff about how our individual psychology works. But then the chapter gets into group dynamics, which is a whole other can of worms. And one of the most fascinating and maybe a little disturbing concepts, is Irving Janis's theory of groupthink.
Yeah, groupthink is a classic. It's basically why smart people, when they're in a group, can make really dumb decisions.
Especially when they're under pressure.
Right, pressure is a huge factor.
Janis said that groupthink happens when you have a group that's really tight-knit, very cohesive.
Like they all think alike and value their unity above all else.
Exactly. And they have a very structured way of doing things, often with a strong, dominant leader. And if there's a lot of time pressure, uncertainty, or stress, it's like a recipe for disaster.
It's like all those factors combine to create this echo chamber where no one wants to rock the boat.
Right. And Janis talks about how in these situations, there's often a dominant ideology, like a set of beliefs that everyone just accepts without question.
And any rules or procedures are kind of arbitrary, not really based on logic or reason, but just on what the leader wants.
And then, of course, the leader usually surrounds themselves with people who agree with them, the yes men.
Yeah.
And anyone who disagrees is either ignored or pushed out.
He's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The leader gets surrounded by people who tell them what they want to hear, and they become more and more convinced that they're right.
And the scary thing is, the people in the group who might be more vulnerable, maybe they have low self-esteem or they don't have a lot of social connections outside the group, they're even more likely to just go along with whatever the leader says.
They don't want to risk being rejected or ostracized.
Exactly. And Janis actually defined groupthink as a way of thinking that people engage in when they are deeply involved in a cohesive in-group, when their desire for unanimity overrides their motivation to realistically appraise alternative courses of action.
So it's not that they're stupid, it's that they're so focused on maintaining harmony and unity within the group that they lose sight of critical thinking.
Yeah, and he looked at some really significant historical examples of groupthink, like the Bay of Pigs invasion, President Truman's decision to invade North Korea, the lack of preparation for Pearl Harbor, and the escalation of the Vietnam War.
Those were all major decisions with far-reaching consequences.
And what's interesting is that Janis identified a bunch of common characteristics in all these cases. Like there's this illusion of invulnerability where the group feels like they can't possibly fail because they're so united and strong.
It's like they develop this collective sense of arrogance.
Right. And then there's the illusion of unanimity where it seems like everyone agrees, even if some people are just keeping quiet to avoid conflict.
And any alternative solutions are seen as a threat to the group's unity and are quickly dismissed.
And sometimes there are even these mind guards, people who actively filter out any information that might challenge the group's chosen course of action.
It's like they're protecting the leader and the group from any dissenting opinions.
And then, of course, new members who come into the group, they often get a very limited or controlled view of information. And a lot of the important decisions happen informally, behind closed doors, so there's even less opportunity for open debate or dissent.
It creates this really insular environment where it's almost impossible to challenge the status quo.
Right. And authoritarian leadership styles definitely play a role in fostering groupthink.
Definitely. When the leader is demanding obedience and not encouraging critical thinking, it's almost inevitable that groupthink will develop.
Janis and Mann even came up with this concept of defensive circumvention, which is basically where group members just go along with the leader's decisions to avoid stress and conflict, even if they have doubts.
It's like they're choosing the path of least resistance, even if it leads them down a dangerous path.
It's like they're trading short-term comfort for potential long-term disaster.
And the book makes this really interesting comparison between groupthink and Orwell's concept of doublethink in 1984.
Doublethink, yeah. That's where you simultaneously hold two contradictory beliefs in your mind.
Exactly. And in a way, groupthink is kind of like that. It's like the group convinces itself that it's being rational and objective, even when it's clearly making irrational decisions.
And that's what makes it so dangerous.
Yeah.
Because when you're in the grip of groupthink, you don't even realize that your thinking is flawed.
Right. It's like this collective blind spot.
It's like the group develops a shared delusion. Totally. So we've talked about how our individual psychology and group dynamics can influence our decision-making. But the chapter also delves into these things called heuristics and shortcuts, which are basically mental strategies we use to make decisions more quickly and efficiently.
Yeah, heuristics are like mental rules of thumb. They're usually pretty helpful, but they can also lead to biases and errors in judgment.
Exactly. And this section also explores this really fascinating concept called the introspection illusion.
Oh, the introspection illusion. That's a good one. It's basically the idea that we think we know why we do the things we do, but often we're totally wrong.
It's like we believe we have this special access to our own thoughts and motivations, but really we're just as clueless as anyone else.
And the research of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky really challenged the idea that we're rational decision makers.
Right. They show that our decisions are often influenced by all sorts of biases and irrational factors that we're not even aware of.
Like the way information is presented to us, for example. They called this decision framing.
Yeah, and they did this classic experiment called the Asian disease problem, which perfectly illustrates how framing can completely change our choices. So imagine there's this outbreak of a deadly disease, and you have to choose between two programs to combat it.
Okay, I'm listening.
Program A guarantees that 200 people will be saved. Program B has a 1/3 chance of saving everyone, 600 people, but a 2/3 chance of saving no one. Which program would you choose?
That's a tough one. I think I'd go with Program A. At least you know for sure that some people will be saved.
That's what most people choose. But now, imagine the same scenario, but framed differently. Program C will result in 400 people dying. Program D has a 1/3 chance that no one will die, but a 2/3 chance that all 600 people will die.
Wow, so the outcomes are basically the same, just framed in terms of losses instead of gains.
Exactly. And what's crazy is that when it's framed this way, most people choose Program D, the riskier option.
So even though the potential outcomes are the same, the way it's presented totally changes our perception of risk.
It's like we're more averse to losses than we are attracted to gains. And this kind of framing effect happens all the time in real life. Think about how products are marketed.
Yeah.
90% fat-free sounds way more appealing than 10% fat, even though it's the same thing.
Or how politicians frame their policies. They might talk about tax relief instead of tax cuts, even though it means the same thing.
It's all about manipulating our perceptions. So our rationality is definitely not as solid as we might think.
Definitely not.
And then there's this idea of mental set or autopilot thinking.
Oh, yeah. That's when we get stuck in our old ways of thinking, even when they're not the most efficient or effective.
Like we're running on autopilot. The chapter talks about this experiment by Lutyens called the water vessel problem.
Oh, I think I've heard of that one. It's the one with the jars, right?
Exactly. So participants are given a series of problems where they have to use different sized jars to measure out a specific amount of water, and they learn a certain formula that works for the first few problems. But then they're given problems that could be solved much more easily using a simpler method, but they keep using the old, more complicated formula.
Because they're so used to it. It's like their brains are stuck in a rut.
And the researchers found that a huge percentage of people did this, even when the simpler solution was staring them right in the face.
It's like they couldn't break free from their established mental patterns.
And this kind of thing happens all the time in real life. Think about how we approach work tasks or even personal relationships.
We often get stuck in our routines and habits even when they're no longer serving us.
And there was this other study by Langer and Moldovianu where they sent a completely absurd memo to a bunch of secretaries. And most of them just followed the instructions without question because it was a formal memo and they were used to following procedures.
That's so funny, but also kind of scary. It shows how easily we can get caught up in routines and lose our critical thinking skills.
Totally. So it's really important to be aware of these mental sets and to actively try to break free from them when they're no longer helpful. And then there's this whole area of research on priming, which shows how even subtle, unconscious cues can influence our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
Priming is fascinating. It's like our brains are constantly picking up on these subtle signals from the environment, and they're shaping our perceptions and actions without us even realizing it.
The chapter talks about some really interesting experiments by John Bargh, like one where participants were subliminally exposed to words related to either politeness or aggressive behavior, and then they were more or less likely to interrupt a conversation depending on which words they were primed with.
So just being exposed to those words, even without consciously processing them, had a measurable effect on their behavior.
It's wild. And then there was another study where people were subliminally primed with age stereotypes, and it actually slowed down their walking speed.
No way, really?
It's crazy, right? And they weren't even aware that it was happening. It's like our brains were automatically adjusting their behavior to fit the stereotype.
It's like our unconscious mind is running the show a lot of the time.
Yeah, it seems like it. And then, maybe even more disturbingly, there's research on how subliminal priming of racial stereotypes can influence our behavior, even if we don't consciously endorse those stereotypes.
Like this study where people were subliminally exposed to images of black faces and then showed higher levels of hostility, even if they weren't consciously racist.
Yeah, it's pretty unsettling. It shows how deeply ingrained these implicit biases can be.
It challenges our whole idea of ourselves as rational, unbiased decision makers.
It really does.
So all this research on priming and framing really starts to chip away at our belief in our own rationality.
Totally. And then there's this thing called the introspection illusion, which is this tendency we have to believe that we have a really good understanding of our own thoughts and motivations, but we often don't extend that same belief to others.
Yeah, it's like we think we have this special insight into our own minds, but we see other people's actions as more superficial or less insightful.
Nisbet and Wilson did a lot of research on this, and they found that we often come up with these elaborate explanations for our behavior, but those explanations are often completely wrong.
We're basically making stuff up to try to make sense of our own actions.
And Pronin later added to this by identifying 4 key components of the introspection illusion. First, we tend to overvalue our own introspective evidence, meaning we give more weight to our own thoughts and feelings than we do to objective evidence. Second, we undervalue other people's introspective evidence, so we're less likely to believe their explanations for their own behavior. Third, we downplay our own behaviors when we're evaluating ourselves, so we focus more on our intentions and less on our actual actions. And fourth, we value our own introspections more than other people's, so we think we know ourselves better than anyone else does.
It's like we're wearing these rose-colored glasses when we look at ourselves.
Totally. And the chapter talks about this classic study called the aura effect, where they showed that students' overall impression of a teacher, whether they liked them or not, influenced their ratings of seemingly unrelated things, like the teacher's attractiveness, mannerisms, and even their accent.
So just liking the teacher made them see everything about them in a more positive light?
Exactly. And the students were totally unaware that their overall impression was influencing their judgments. They thought they were being objective.
It's like this halo effect.
And this kind of bias happens all the time in real life. Like when we meet someone new and we instantly like them, we might overlook their flaws or interpret their actions in a more positive way.
Or if we dislike someone, we might be more critical of everything they do.
Exactly. So this introspection illusion is something to be really aware of because it can lead us to make all sorts of biased judgments.
Definitely. And it can also make it harder to learn from our mistakes because we're not always willing to acknowledge our own biases.
Right. And the chapter also touches on this whole area of subliminal messaging, which is something that's always fascinated people.
Subliminal messaging, yeah. It's the idea that we can be influenced by messages that are presented below our conscious awareness.
Like those supposed subliminal messages in movies that tell you to buy popcorn.
Right. There was that famous experiment by James Vickery in the 1950s where he claimed to have increased popcorn and Coca-Cola sales by flashing those messages during a movie.
But it turned out that was a hoax. He made the whole thing up.
Yeah, he admitted it later.
But it really captured the public's imagination and made people worried about the possibility of being manipulated without their knowledge.
It's like this fear of mind control.
And it led to all sorts of concerns about subliminal advertising and even attempts to regulate it.
But the chapter does mention that while Vickery's experiment was fake, there is some evidence that subliminal stimuli can have a subtle influence on our behavior, even if it's not as powerful as some people might think.
Like the study where people were subliminally primed with words related to either cooperation or competition, and it actually influenced their performance on a subsequent task.
So it seems like subliminal messaging can have an effect, but it's probably not something to be too worried about.
Yeah, it's probably not going to turn us into mindless zombies or anything.
But it is something to be aware of.
Definitely. And then the chapter gets into a whole bunch of fascinating examples of how priming can influence group decision-making in really subtle ways.
Yeah, this is where all these different concepts we've been talking about really come together.
It's like this whole web of unconscious influences that are shaping our choices when we're in a group.
And one example is this research on metaphorical mapping by Boroditsky, which showed that the way we frame temporal events spatially, like whether we think of a meeting as moving forward or not, can influence how we interpret ambiguous time statements.
So just the way we think about time spatially can change how we understand it.
And then there are the studies by Meyer and Schubert on the hidden semantics of verticality, which showed that people are faster to categorize words related to God and power when they're presented at the top of a screen, and words related to devil and powerlessness when they're presented at the bottom.
So it's like we have these unconscious associations between verticality and concepts like power and divinity.
And it's not just spatial metaphors. There's also research on how priming the sense of intimacy can influence our perception of temperature.
Like the study by Iserman and Semin, where people who felt more similar to another person actually perceived the room temperature as warmer.
And Zong and Leonardelli found that recalling a time when you felt socially excluded can make you feel physically colder.
It's amazing how our social and emotional experiences can actually influence our physical sensations.
And then there's the silence at the library experiment, where people who were primed with images of a library actually spoke more quietly during a subsequent task, even though they weren't explicitly told to be quiet.
It's like our brains are picking up on those subtle environmental cues and adjusting our behavior accordingly.
And the research by Boss, Dijksterhuis, and Van Baren showed that our unconscious thought processes can continue to influence our decisions even after we've been distracted from the original decision-making task.
So it's like our brains are working on problems in the background without us even realizing it.
And then there's the study by Chang and colleagues on priming warrior or domestic symbolism, which showed that men who were primed with images of war were faster to recognize attractive female faces, suggesting that these ancient evolutionary drives are still influencing our behavior in subtle ways.
It's like we're all walking around with these primal instincts that can be triggered by certain cues.
And Fitzsimons and Barg found that priming people with thoughts of a friend actually increased their willingness to help others, especially among men.
So thinking about close relationships can actually make us more generous and pro-social.
And then there's the research on priming performance, which showed that people who were subliminally exposed to performance-related words actually performed better on subsequent tasks.
It's like just thinking about success can actually make us more successful.
And Bem's research on affective priming showed that even brief exposure to positive or negative images can influence our preferences for neutral stimuli.
So our emotions can definitely influence our judgments without us even realizing it.
And the study by Nisbet and Bellows with the hypothetical job applicants showed how easily we can be swayed by irrelevant contextual cues, like a candidate spilling coffee during an interview.
We create these narratives in our heads, and then we stick to them, even if they're not based on the actual evidence.
And finally, there's the fascinating less is better effect, which shows that we sometimes value things more highly when they're presented in a smaller package or when they're perceived as more scarce.
Like the study where people were willing to pay more for a smaller portion of ice cream when it was presented in a fancier cup.
Or the study where people were willing to pay more for an iPod Touch when it didn't come with a free MP3 download.
It's like we value things more when they're perceived as exclusive or unique. So as you can see from this deep dive into Ellen Gavriliuk's chapter, the way we think, make decisions, and interact in groups is far more complex and nuanced than we might think. Our thoughts and behaviors are constantly being shaped by all sorts of subtle, unconscious influences, from the way information is presented to us, to the environment we're in, to the people we're with. And understanding these influences can help us to make more informed decisions, avoid common biases, and ultimately have a greater understanding of ourselves and the world around us. So I hope you found this exploration as fascinating as we did. And I encourage you to think about the implications of these insights in your own life. Are there any situations where you might be susceptible to groupthink? When was the last time you got stuck in a mental rut? Are there any metaphorical forbidden rooms that are influencing your desires? And how can you become more aware of the subtle cues that are shaping your thoughts and behaviors? This is really just the beginning of a much larger conversation about social cognition. So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep challenging your own assumptions about how the human mind works.
That's great advice. And I think the most important takeaway is to be humble. We all have biases and we all make irrational decisions sometimes. But by being aware of these tendencies, we can start to mitigate their negative effects.
Absolutely. Awareness is the first step to change. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.